Hello and welcome to the Rect Capital channel, and welcome to today's first episode about Bitcoin. And we're going to be focusing on Bitcoin on the monthly, daily and 4-hour chart, because all of these are going to give us a holistic picture as to what's going on with Bitcoin's price action. And we're also going to be comparing what was Bitcoin like prior to halving 1 and what was it like prior to halving 3, which is coming up in May 2020. So in terms of the macro context, let's dive right in. Let's look at the macro context right away. And we're going to be looking at two different things. We're going to be looking at the monthly range, which has been a very important range. It's been a very important price context to just understand Bitcoin, because all of these different price levels, they've been pretty significant. They've been offering a lot of market reaction for the past while, really, because if we look at this range right over here, this is the June candle. So we saw a breakout from the monthly range. This in particular is the range that we're talking about. This is going to be the range low, 7,750. The range EQ, which is essentially the equilibrium point, the midpoint of any range, and that's 8,500 roughly speaking. And we have the range high, which is the 9,300 range, and this is of course the range that we're going to be talking about. We see a breakout to new yearly highs. Afterwards, we see a pullback, a rejection from 13,900. And ever since, we've been just making these sort of lower highs on price. But what I want you to focus on at the moment is that we saw a breakout past the range, a retest, a successful retest of this range, and then once again in the following month we saw a retest again, which is also successfully retested here. But of course, we're always seeing these lower highs, and at some point last month in particular we saw a breakdown into the range, and we actually revisited the bottom of that range, the range low of 7,770 or 50. But at the moment, we're actually seeing a doji candle. Now, of course, don't mind these lower time frame drawings. They're going to become very much clear. They're going to be very apparent as we go through this video. But for the time being, what I want you to focus on is this range. This is the macro range that has been very important in terms of all these different market reactions. And for the time being, this range is still holding strong. The bottom of this range is still doing well. It's offering some support. Nothing's breaking down at the moment. We're still seeing a doji printing this month of October. So let's zoom into the daily time frame. Let's look at what's going under the hood of Bitcoin's price action. We can see that there's a 44% retrace from the new yearly highs of 13.9k. And we're currently seeing that, well, really, Bitcoin's just kind of meandering within the lower half of its monthly range, from the range low of 7,770 to the range EQ of 8,500. So essentially, Bitcoin is kind of stuck in the lower half of this range, and it's kind of just meandering there. And have we seen this sort of price predicament in the past? Well, we've seen a 44% retrace now. In the past, if we look at the Bitcoin halving, or at least its first ever halving in November 2012, then we'll see that we also saw an exponential run up, just like we saw this year for Bitcoin, where it just bottomed in mid-December at around 3,200 and then rallied exponentially to 13,900. So that's essentially what we're seeing over here in this block of price action. We also saw an exponential run up, pretty much uninterrupted, very similar to what we saw this year for Bitcoin, and then we saw a retrace right over here. Now, of course, this is actually taken from my Bitcoin halving article. I pretty much addressed the question of how does the Bitcoin halving impact Bitcoin's price, and it's a pretty good read. It's very detailed. There are many different charts and analyses, and I pretty much come to a conclusion that there are a few historical tendencies that are very important, and they're very important because they're recurring, so they happen every time we see a halving. So check it out if you haven't read it, but essentially speaking, for the purpose of this video, I'm using this chart just to show you that there was a retrace after an exponential run-up, and this retrace was minus 45%. So it is quite similar to minus 44%, but if we want to be a bit more meticulous, if we want to be a bit more methodical, Let's look at this wick over here. This wick, well, that wick was a flash outlier wick. So if you want to be really meticulous, you can actually say that this wasn't a minus 45% retrace, it was actually a minus 47% retrace. So let's bear this in mind. Let's think about the macro monthly range that we were talking about just a second ago, and let's think about the market cycles of Bitcoin. The fact that we had an exponential run up followed by a 47% retrace. We're seeing much of the same now. But if we want to think about what Bitcoin has to do for it to reach the minus 45% retrace mark, then it would have to retrace to about 7,650, somewhere around that price range. If Bitcoin were to repeat its history and produce a wick like it did prior to halving one on that first retrace in its new bull market, if it retraced minus 47%, then it would be around 7,350, 320, something like that. So if we just gel this together, we pretty much have a price range of 7,350 to 7,620 or 6,050. So we've got that price range, and that kind of respects the previous market cycles for Bitcoin. So if we think about that and we try to gel this together with the monthly macro range, then of course we'd have to see a breakdown from this range low for that to happen. But at the same time, we'd maybe see a wick, just like we saw prior to halving one on that first retrace, a wick to lower levels just to gain that liquidity, to gain the interest of those buyers, and then finally push price up. So these kind of market cycle tendencies that we're seeing here prior to halving one and prior to halving three, which is still yet to come in May 2020, we're seeing a bit of similarities. It is quite similar. But the thing that we need to pay attention to on the daily time frame, so we are going to be zooming in a bit, we have to pay attention to this mid-range, because the range EQ, the equilibrium point, the mid-range of this 1 month range, it is a resistance at the moment, but at the same time we're seeing a confluent resistance in the 200 exponential moving average. And this 200 EMA matters because it's a long-term gauge of investor sentiment, and essentially speaking, investors look at the chart, they turn on this moving average and they say, if Bitcoin's above the 200 EMA, then it's bullish. If it's below the 200 EMA, then it's bearish. And that's pretty much the way to think about the 200 EMA. It's a very good gauge of investor sentiment and what their mood is. What are they feeling towards Bitcoin? Are they feeling bullish or are they feeling bearish? And at the moment, if you want to consider the daily time frame, then they are pretty much bearish, but at the same time, we are seeing a developing bullish tendency in this higher low. This black uptrending line over here is essentially showing to us that with every dip that Bitcoin makes, buyers are stepping in. They're more curious and they're more interested in buying Bitcoin at a premium. So over here, the first buyers on this wick right over here, once we saw Bitcoin meet this range, or the range low of 7,750, this wick was met by a nice market reaction, and then when it dipped, we actually saw price make its first higher low, where essentially buyers are buying at a premium, and then of course buyers are still buying at a premium right over here. So essentially we are seeing this developing bullish tendency where people are just buying at a premium more and more. So that is a good sign. That's a positive sign for Bitcoin. And if we tie it in with what we understand with the previous market cycles and the 45-47% retrace, then you could reasonably assume that this is the bottom of the retrace for Bitcoin. Now, of course, it is very important that this macro monthly range is going to hold. The range low cannot give in. It can't break down and then see some further downside unless it's a wick. And that's a good sign, because then we see that dip into liquidity for buyers to really step in and produce that market reaction for a reversal. But for the time being, even if we cycle to the very first chart, we can see that there is a doji here, and this spinning top candle, doji, spinning top, it's pretty much the same thing. that kind of signals a reversal about to form. We're seeing that selling is tapering off and that we might see a reversal. But I don't want to focus on this candle too much because it is early on in the month. We're only midway through October, so I'm not going to focus too much on candlestick analysis, but it is something to bear in mind in your analysis. But what I do want to focus is on the even more zoomed in time frame. So we looked at the monthly, we then looked at the daily, and now we're looking at the 4-hour time frame. And we're looking at this 4-hour time frame because I want to take myself out of business. So what I mean by that is whenever you're a trader and you're an investor, you want to develop a view on the market. And if you develop a bullish view, like we're trying to now, we're trying to find ways on how Bitcoin can be bullish, how Bitcoin can be potentially bottoming over here. You want to develop a view where you'll take yourself out of business and where you'll be wrong. And this is going to give you a lot of valuable insight and valuable perspectives whenever you're trying to take yourself out of business, whenever you're trying to see how your trade or your investment could go wrong. And this is exactly what we're going to be looking at. We're going to be looking at the 4-hour chart. We're seeing this higher low, but at the same time, we're seeing lower highs. And this frames Bitcoin within a flagging structure. And you can say a lot about this flag at the moment, but sometimes if we invert the chart, we can have more clarity. We can have a better view as to what is going on. And at the moment, this looks very bullish to me. Of course, this is the inverted chart. Have a look at the descending price levels right over here. We have 8,200 over here and 740 over here. So we are on the inverted chart, and we can see that this is actually a very bullish price context for Bitcoin. You can even see that the EMA, the 200 EMA is a support. You can see that there is a bullish flag essentially forming over here. This is a flag pole to that flag. So if we're looking at this flag on the inverted chart, we can see that this is a very bullish context. But of course, if we invert it back, it's a potentially bearish context. So this is essentially a bearish flag. So this is the flagpole of the bear flag, and this is the flag itself. So this is essentially the counter argument to what we were talking about previously in this video. And this is why this entire price predicament for Bitcoin is very important. The flag, essentially. The mid-range resistance, which is confluent with the 200 EMA resistance, and this lower high uptrending trend line, which is the top of the flag. So we're seeing a lot of confluent resistance. That is quite worrying. This is a legitimate concern for me because there is a lot of resistance in this area. We're not seeing a lot of movement from Bitcoin in the lower half of this monthly range. Remember, essentially speaking, this flag is trapped in the lower half of the macro monthly range. So we are seeing a lot of resistance here. We are seeing some flagging. Essentially speaking, all I want for Bitcoin to do, for it to retain or at least regain that bullish momentum that's been building through this higher low, I want it to break up past this mid-range resistance. If it can do that and maybe test it as support, it will still be in the flag. It will still be under 200 EMA, but that's the first step it has to take. Essentially speaking, I wanted to breach this level, this area, the confluent rejection zone. So it would have to breach past 8,850, 8,900, something like that. So that's why it's very important to just wait for that confirmation whether we're going to see a break up to the upside or a breakdown to the downside, because a break up, of course, could lead Bitcoin to 9,300. That's the range high resistance of the monthly range. This is where we might see a bit of rejection, and we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. I don't want to get too ahead of myself at this time. I just want to talk in terms of scenarios, and the scenario if Bitcoin breaks down, then of course the bottom of the monthly range would be once again something that we'd need to consider, especially if we see this higher low breach, because if this higher low breaches, then that bullish momentum is going to be pretty much lost. It's going to be gone, and things will become very interesting, especially for people who want to accumulate at lower levels once the bottom of the macro monthly range is breached. And that's just about it for today's Bitcoin update. We looked at Bitcoin through the lens of the monthly, the daily, and the 4-hourly timeframes. And we looked at the bullish context in terms of its macro market cycles, as well as its macro monthly range. And we also looked at how this could be a potentially bullish context, but we're also looking at the bearish context. We always have to look at ways how we could potentially take ourselves out of business, and we have to be able to adapt to whatever happens. We have to have that confirmation, and we understand which levels have to breach for us to flip our directional bias. So that was a very important lesson, but I also want to leave you with this last final thing, and that's cognitive reappraisal. You have to reappraise, reinterpret things to your benefit. So I do understand that many people might be stressed at these levels because Bitcoin has retraced 44%, but at the same time you can reappraise or reinterpret that to your benefit and just interpret this as a time for opportunity, a time for excitement, not stress and fear, but excitement and opportunity. And I truly feel that Bitcoin is at a juncture where excitement and opportunity very much ring very true. Thank you so much for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe to this channel if you'd like to see these videos in the future. And of course, leave a comment. I'm very interested to hear your thoughts. What do you think might happen to Bitcoin next? I'm Rect Capital, and I'll speak to you soon.